All of us are familiar with ethics, ethical problems, ethical dilemmas. Every profession has an ethical code that it has to follow. In this part of the course, we're going to be talking about the ethical code that researchers have to follow. And based on a wonderful chapter from the Wendy Schweigert textbook, Research Methods in Psychology, a Handbook, I'm going to be sharing with you some of her insights about the ethical treatment of human participants, ethical dilemmas, privacy, deception, and the ethical treatment of animal participants. I'll also touch on ethics and the reporting of research results, and ethics and the sponsorship of research. Here's a quote from the American Psychological Association's Ethics Code in 1982. For psychologists, one of their obligations is to use their research skills to extend knowledge for the sake of ultimate human betterment. Psychologists begin with the commitment that the distinctive contribution of scientists to human welfare is the development of knowledge and its intelligent application to appropriate problems. Their underlying ethical imperative, thus, is to conduct research as well as they know how. End of quote. Now, psychologists conduct research not only because they enjoy the process, remember that discursive process we talked about, but also because psychology as a discipline is defined by and dependent on psychological research. You cannot be a clinician if you don't have an appreciation for the science, because all of the treatments are based on psychological research. However, conducting research requires awareness and consideration of a number of ethical concerns. Two major areas of ethical consideration are: one, the treatment of participants while the research is being conducted, and two, the use of the research results. So let's first of all talk about the ethical treatment of research participants. The participants of psychological research are usually either animals or humans. How the participants are treated during the course of a research project is in part mandated by law and in part regulated by guidelines developed by psychologists. And in part, it's determined by the researcher's own consciousness. Together, these three factors, the law, the regulations developed by psychologists, and the researcher's own conscience, lead to research that not only provides valuable information about behavior, but also protects the dignity of the human and animal participants. The ethical treatment of human research participants is the primary responsibility of the researcher, and that's true of animals as well. It is the researcher who decides what research to do and what method to use. The researcher might decide not to investigate a certain topic or to use a particular method because he or she is uncomfortable with the ethical ramifications. In other cases, a researcher may not easily perceive genuine ethical problems with a method he or she was planning to use. So to help researchers see their projects from others' points of view, and an attempt to ensure the safety and well-being of human participants in research, we have institutional review boards, or IRBs, that review proposals for research with human participants. IRBs are committees of individuals with diverse backgrounds who review proposals for research with human participants. Members of an IRB at a college may include faculty members from different academic departments, as well as members of the community, and also sometimes administrators. The diverse background of the members help bring different perspectives to the review process. All research, that is, all research using human participants that is federally funded must be reviewed by an IRB. But changes in the law in 1981 and subsequent revisions exempted some other types of research from review. For example, if the research involves common educational practices, like what goes on in schools, or if the research with participants remains totally anonymous, that is, no one, not even the researcher, knows the identity of the participants, then this research does not have to be reviewed by an IRB. However, in an effort to guarantee the ethical treatment of human participants, most colleges and universities review all research proposals involving human participants that are carried out at that institution, and many institutions do not allow exemptions from this review. Typically, a researcher has to complete an application form for the IRB that asks specific questions about the procedures to be used in a research project. It also asks whether there are any known risks or benefits related to the procedures, and importantly, it also asks how the participants' confidentiality will be maintained. Often, a detailed research proposal is supplied with the application. An important part of the application to the IRB is the informed consent form. The informed consent form is given to each participant prior to participation in the project, and it describes the purpose of the study and many other important things like what the participants are actually going to do. We'll give you some more examples of this in a second ethics lecture. If the participants are children, the consent form is read to them and signed by each child's parent or guardian. The children also have to be asked if they want to participate, and they should feel free to say no or to end their participation at any time, and that's true of anyone who's participating in research, not just children. I've been a member of an IRB, and I always put the most emphasis on the informed consent form when evaluating a proposal. It may be the only information the participant receives about what to expect and what risks and benefits are involved, so it's essential that it's accurate, understandable, and clearly written. The goal of an informed consent form is not to convince the individual to sign it. Rather, the goal is to provide enough information so that he or she can make an informed decision. The consent form simply documents that the person has consented to participate, and review of the form by the IRB ensures that he or she is given adequate information to make an informed consent, and that they're not coerced in any way to make this decision. Although the consent form provides much information about the study, the researcher will typically describe the study to the participant orally as well, and offer an opportunity for the participant to ask questions. A researcher who has spent the time to plan and develop a research project may sometimes regard review by an IRB as an unnecessary hurdle before data collection can begin. However, the importance of an impartial review should not be underestimated. Ethical concerns are not always obvious. Subtle and inconspicuous effects may easily be overlooked, particularly if the researcher is very gung-ho and interested in their study. One researcher used a procedure that involved rapidly presenting slides to participants. During its development, the researcher tried the procedure on herself and a number of willing friends to no ill effect. But an impartial reviewer who experienced the procedure found it gave him a headache. Of course, the risk of headache or other discomfort was added to the informed consent form. Had it not been for that reviewer's comment and the inclusion of that risk in the information provided to participants, those who experience headaches from the procedure may have believed that I was trying to hide a negative effect, or that this researcher was trying to hide a negative effect. Ignoring ethical problems does not make them go away. They can also harm the reputation of the researcher, they can harm the reputation of the institution, and they can harm the field of psychology as a whole. They can also get you into a lot of trouble with the law and with the profession if something goes terribly wrong in a study. Concern for participants' welfare doesn't start at the IRB, nor does approval of the procedure by the IRB release the researcher from responsibility for any ethical violations the board may have missed. Ethical considerations must be developed throughout the development of the project, throughout the research process. You always have to be paying attention to ethical issues. To aid researchers in identifying important ethical concerns, the APA, or the American Psychological Association, which is this national organization of psychologists and people in related fields, has developed a set of fundamental principles, and these are called the APA Ethical Principles in the Conduct of Research. And in our textbook and in several other books, these are summarized for you. You can also go on the APA website and look at them directly for yourself. According to the ethical research principles, a researcher is obligated to make a careful ethical evaluation of any proposed methodology. Excuse me. If there is any question of an ethical violation, the researcher should seek ethical advice from others, like from a philosopher, from somebody in religion, or another researcher. Thus, even when an IRB review is not required, a researcher should not hesitate to ask other individuals for advice. So what's the primary ethical concern? Well, it's whether the participants of the experiment would be at risk or even at minimal risk. What is risk? Risk can be defined as the potential for physical or psychological harm to a research participant. Although the APA does not define minimal risk, the definition used by IRBs reviewing biomedical and behavioral research is as follows. Now listen carefully. This is from the public welfare law that established the IRBs. Minimal risk means that the probability and magnitude of harm or discomfort anticipated in the research are not greater in and of themselves than those ordinarily encountered in daily life or during the performance of routine physical or psychological examinations or tests. Let me say that again. Excuse me. What is minimal risk? Minimal risk means that the probability and magnitude of harm or discomfort anticipated in the research are not greater in and of themselves than those ordinarily encountered in daily life or during the performance of routine physical or psychological examinations or tests. So, if the procedures involved in an experiment cause no more physical or psychological stress than a person would expect to encounter in everyday life, then it's considered minimal risk, and then it's okay. If the risk does not cause any greater risk of harm than a person usually faces, then a participant is at minimal risk. A person who spends an hour carrying out a very boring task in a psychological experiment may experience the discomfort of being bored, but this is not likely to be any more harmful or stressful to the individual than the boredom encountered in everyday life. Similarly, completing a paper and pencil psychological test, such as a personality test like the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory or the MMPI, which entails answering about 500 true and false questions, can be so long, somewhat stressful. However, it is not unusual for students to be tested with long, somewhat stressful paper and pencil examinations. So students completing the MMPI in a research study, or any person for that matter, would probably be considered at minimal risk. Now, maybe this is minimal risk for students, but perhaps it wouldn't be minimal risk for someone who was 78 or 80 if they had to fill out a 500 question true and false, a 500 item true and false test. Let's think about that one. It is the researcher's responsibility to assess whether the participants are at risk or are at minimal risk. If the researcher believes the participants may be at risk, a decision must be made regarding whether the risk to the participants outweighs the possible benefits of the knowledge gained. When the risk is relatively small compared to the possible gains, most advisory boards allow the research to be conducted, that is, with fully informed consent for the participants, of course. The greater the risk to the participants of a study, however, the greater is the researcher's obligation to consider alternative procedures that present a smaller level of risk. When you're thinking about risk and benefit, you might want to imagine a scale, like the scales of justice that you might see the Grecian figure with the blindfold carrying. On one side you have the risk, on the other side you have the benefits. If there's minimal risk and some benefit to the participants of participating, then we might say the benefits outweigh the risk. However, if the risk part of the scale is lower than the benefit part of the scale, so that the risks are heavier or more serious or more weighty than the benefits, then the study probably, not probably, but in all likelihood, should never be conducted, and it wouldn't be approved by an IRB. If an investigation or a research study involves some risk of negative effects, the risk must be made absolutely clear to the participants. If the risk is serious, as we said before, the investigator is obligated to consider alternative procedures. If there are no alternative procedures, an important decision must be made. Can you imagine what this decision is? Should the research be scrapped? Or do the potential benefits of the knowledge from the research outweigh the risks to the participants? Quite a weighty question. Research involving serious risk to the participants should only be undertaken if there are great potential benefits, or when the risk to the participants would be even greater if the research were not conducted. Regardless of whether an advisory board has given the go-ahead for the project, and regardless of whether the researcher is the person who actually collects the data for the project, the researcher is always responsible for ensuring that the project is conducted in an ethical manner. Often, students or technicians who work for the researcher will actually conduct the research, and if a research assistant behaves unethically, both the assistant and the primary researcher are responsible for that behavior and for alleviating any negative side effects caused by it. In addition to informing the participants of any risk as well as any benefits participation might involve, the researcher should also answer all of the participants' questions about the study. This may require some special effort if the participants are children or people with mental or physical limitations that hinder communication. But it is an important step that ascertains that the participant fully understands what is expected and what to expect. And this is also going to help make sure that the researcher does not lose participants during the course of the study because they drop out because they weren't informed about the actual details of the study. Special efforts to safeguard the participants are also required when full disclosure of the purpose of the study or the procedures prior to the investigation might impair the validity of the results. Here's an example. Let's say we're doing an investigation of reactions to emergency situations. In this case, the researcher cannot tell the participants that a staged emergency situation is about to occur, and still be certain that the results reflect what the participants would do in real life. In other words, you have to fool people sometimes to see what their reaction's going to be. According to the APA, studies involving deception, that is, deception means you're either lying to participants or misleading them temporarily, or you're concealing something from them, should only be conducted when there's no known alternative procedure available, and if the researcher does not deceive the participants about any factors that might affect their willingness to participate. So deception is only okay under certain circumstances. You can't lie to people about what factors might affect their willingness to participate, and sometimes you can't lie and use deception if there's some other way you could do the study and find out the results. Studies involving deception or concealment can only be conducted if the participants know the true purpose of the study as soon as possible. So typically this means they have to be debriefed, or the situation has to be explained to them, and you have to alleviate any negative feelings they might have about having been deceived immediately after the study has been conducted. Not the whole study, but after that participant has finished their participation. Even if a participant has signed a consent form, he or she still has the right to quit the study at any time. Now, obviously, this can be very frustrating for an investigator. Moreover, if participants from one group quit the project more than participants from another group, it can affect how we interpret the results, or even whether the results can be interpreted. However, as frustrating and disappointed as a researcher might be when a participant decides to withdraw from an investigation, no effort can be made to convince the person to stay. The person is a volunteer, and it is the participant's right to terminate his or her participation, and that right absolutely must be respected. Now, a researcher can also not use any undue effort or coercion to convince a person to serve as a participant in an investigation. The participant must be in a situation allowing free consent. Free consent is given without coercion or pressure to comply. Clearly, whining and pleading by the researcher are unacceptable. However, it's also important to guard against situations in which a person feels coerced because the researcher might be in a position of authority over them. For example, a student may feel pressure, imagined or not, to participate in an investigation conducted by his or her advisor. Or a patient may wonder if declining to participate in a study will affect the medical treatment they're provided. An employee may wonder if volunteering to serve as a participant might translate to a few more dollars in the next raise. A researcher who is in the position of influence or authority must make extra efforts to avoid any real or even any perceived sense of coercion of participants, but potential participants, that is. Even in studies that do not involve deception, the actual purpose of the study may not fully be explained at the time the procedures are described. When the participants know the purpose of the study, they often try, in a spirit of helpfulness, to behave in the way they think the experimenter wants. Thus, while the procedure, risk, and benefits might be described in detail, the reason for conducting the study might not be explained thoroughly before the person participates. Now, in the APA ethical guidelines, it states that the information about the purpose of the study should be provided as soon as possible after the data has been collected, just as in the situation of deception. This is called, again, what is it called? Okay, hopefully you got it right. It's called debriefing the participant. Often debriefing occurs immediately after the individual's data has been collected. At other times, debriefing may be provided at a later date after the data are collected from all the participants. Sometimes this is necessary to prevent knowledge of the study's purpose from leaking from others before they participate in the study. And if you think this is going to happen, it is considered okay to wait until the data is collected before you inform the participants about what the purpose of the study is. This is more difficult to do if deception's involved, because you never know if that deception is going to harm someone after they've participated in a study. Now, let's go on to talk a little bit about confidentiality. Unless other arrangements have been made between the researcher and a participant prior to data collection, all information collected during the course of the project is confidential, which means that the information collected will not be shared with anyone outside of the research project. And confidentiality is not a principle to be taken lightly. Offhand comments to others about a silly thing a participant did during the study serve only to undermine the respectability of the researcher and of the research process and of psychology in general. In other cases, the information gained from a participant may be very sensitive and could cause the person great distress if it was learned by others outside of the experiment. Perhaps more importantly, if participants know that the information they give will be kept confidential, they can let their guard down and act naturally. This is essential in psychological research, where the value of the results depend on participants reflecting real behavior. I'm going to address a couple of ethical dilemmas now, like privacy and deception, using some examples. Now, although the guidelines we've just talked about aid researchers in their decisions about how and when to conduct a research project, they are only guidelines and not laws. Researchers can stray from them with legal impunity. For example, a researcher who learns from a participant that he or she plans to commit a serious crime may feel morally entitled, and in some cases may be legally required to breach confidentiality and report this information to the appropriate authorities. In fact, evidence supplied during the course of a research project can be subpoenaed by a court. Furthermore, these ethical guidelines were developed to be applicable to a broad array of research procedures and to reflect the ethical beliefs of a great number of psychologists. Because of this, they do not address ethical questions that some people find especially important. For example, when is it acceptable to observe behavior, and when is observation a violation of privacy? Is it ever acceptable to use deception in research, or do such practices represent disrespect for human dignity? Let's talk a bit about privacy. Privacy refers to an invisible physical or psychological buffer zone or boundary surrounding a person. This is a definition that Siebler and Stanley gave in 1988. Not uncommonly, research is designed to access information within those boundaries. So this could include information about sex, child-rearing practices, personal relationships, and issues of morality. In some cases, the researcher can ask permission to gain this information. When participants voluntarily complete a questionnaire on their buying habits or religious beliefs, or whether they've committed crimes, they have agreed to share this private information. In other cases, researchers may observe people who are unaware that they're being watched. Here's an example. In one study, men were observed by means of a periscope to study the effect of invasion of personal space on their rate of urination. In the condition in which the participant's personal space was invaded, a confederate, that is somebody who was working with the researcher in a public restroom, would urinate in the urinal next to the participant. In conditions without invasion, the confederate obviously was not present. This is done in a study by Middlemiss, Knowles, and Matter in 1976. Ugh, yuck. Obviously, in this study, there was no opportunity to gain informed consent from the participants. And remember, you don't have to gain informed consent if you're studying people's behavior in public and it's anonymous. If you were a member of an IRB reviewing a proposal for this study, what kinds of questions would you ask about the research, and what would your decision be? Would you allow the study to be conducted as described, or would you suggest some modifications, or perhaps simply deny permission for it to be undertaken? These are some things that we may discuss in our synchronous meetings, so please keep track of these questions. Here they go again. What kinds of questions would you ask about the purpose of this study? Would you allow the study to be conducted as it's described, or would you make some suggestions on modifying it? Or would you just deny permission for it to be undertaken, and why? Another ethical dilemma is deception. In a now famous, or you might say infamous, study of obedience by Stanley Milgram in 1963 and in 1977, participants were led to believe that they were inflicting dangerous levels of electrical shock to a second participant whenever the second participant failed to answer a question correctly. Now, in reality, the shock machine was inoperable, but the person who was giving the shock was deceived into thinking that they were actually giving the shock. And the second participant was a confederate, that is, somebody who was acting and pretending they were shocked. About half of the participants continued to give shocks as instructed by the experimenter until the maximum shock level was reached. Milgram was soundly criticized by his colleagues, the press, and the general public for deceiving his participants and causing them to experience the stress associated with a distasteful truth about themselves. People were horrified to think that they blindly followed the obedience or the rules or the suggestions of the researcher and inflicted harm on another person. During immediate debriefings and during one-year follow-up interviews with his participants, Milgram reported that only about 1% of the people wished they had not participated in the study, and that most of the participants were very glad that they had. The positive reaction of Milgram's participants to being deceived in psychological research appears not to be unusual. Here's another study that kind of demonstrates the same thing. Phil, Zakia, and Zeichner in 1981 interviewed people who had participated in research involving deception, shock, and alcohol. Of these participants, 19% reported being bothered by some part of the study, and of these 19%, 4% were bothered by the deception. Most were bothered by the consumption of alcohol and the speed with which it was consumed. In another study, 464 participants were asked their opinions of the research projects that they had been involved in. This was done by Smith and Richardson in 1983. The participants who had experienced deception in research reported greater educational benefit and enjoyment of these experiences than did the participants who had not experienced deception. Those who study participants' reactions to research suspect that debriefing is an important step in making participants feel positive toward an experience that involved deception. In a replication of Milgram's obedience study, only 4% of debriefed individuals wished that they had not participated in the study, but approximately 50% of those who had not been debriefed wished they had not participated. In some research, debriefing itself may be unethical. In research where participants act cruelly or prejudicially, that is, they're prejudiced, it may be better not to point out their behavior in a debriefing. For example, imagine that a person on crutches stumbles in front of you and drops some books. And, for whatever reason, you choose not to assist the person. It may be more damaging to learn that your behavior was observed and recorded than it would be for you to simply go on your way without realizing that you were part of a research project. Perhaps deception in research is more of a problem for researchers and ethicists than for the participants of the investigation. And perhaps that is how it should be. For the goal of ethical treatment of research participants is that they not be discomforted by the procedures of the investigation. Maybe the evidence that participants are not distressed by deception they face in research suggests that researchers have been successfully able to minimize the negative effects of deception. Now, don't get me wrong. Don't get me wrong. I'm not saying that or arguing that deception should be used in research. Ideally, it should be avoided. Some would say that its use is never justified. However, we should keep in mind, I'm sorry, I'm having a couple of technical difficulties here. However, we should keep in mind that about 44% of psychological research in the past has used deception. That's a lot of deception. And we should not expect that the use of deception will stop in the future, at least in the near future. It's important, though, that those who oppose deception in research remain vocal, for they help to ensure that researchers make a diligent effort to minimize the negative effects of deception on participants in psychological research. And that is the end of this discussion.